Commander Vex stared at the holographic display with the kind of expression reserved for watching someone try to eat soup with a fork. The numbers couldn't be right. They simply couldn't be. "Run the diagnostic again," he ordered, his forearms gesturing frantically at the console operators scattered around the command center. Lieutenant Kara, her tentacles dancing nervously across her workstation, looked up with wide, luminescent eyes. "Sir, I've run it 12 times. The results are consistent." "Consistent," Vex repeated slowly, as if tasting each syllable. "You're telling me that a human, a single solitary human, just broke through our most advanced military simulation in 7 minutes and 14 seconds. 7 minutes and 13.7 seconds, to be precise," squeaked tech specialist Blip from his corner station. His voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom, which was particularly embarrassing considering he was 342 years old. The silence that followed was so thick you could have carved it up and served it at a dinner party. Somewhere in the depths of the massive space station, machinery hummed with the kind of efficiency that made the Galactic Council proud. That same efficiency now felt like mockery. "And remind me," Vex continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "how long did our top military strategists take to complete this same simulation?" Kara's tentacles curled inward, a sure sign of distress among her species. "The fastest completion time was achieved by General Thox of the warrior caste. 43 hours, 17 minutes. 43 hours, Vex repeated, each word falling like a stone into still water. "And this human, what was his name again?" "Jake Morrison, sir. Lieutenant Jake Morrison of the Terran Space Corps." Lieutenant Morrison completed in 7 minutes what our best general took nearly 2 days to accomplish. Vex's laugh had all the warmth of a black hole. "Tell me, Kara, what exactly was Lieutenant Morrison's strategy?" The bridge crew exchanged glances like students caught cheating on an exam. Finally, Kara spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't follow any recognized strategy, sir." "Oh, this should be good." Vex leaned back in his command chair, all 4 arms crossed. "Please, enlighten us." Kara's fingers, tentacle tips danced across her console, bringing up a 3-dimensional replay of the simulation. The holographic display showed a standard military scenario, a heavily fortified enemy position on a contested moon, complete with energy shields, automated defense turrets, and enough firepower to level a small city. "The simulation begins with standard parameters," Kara began, sounding like a professor delivering bad news about exam results. "The attacking force has limited resources, 3 possible approach vectors, and must neutralize the target while minimizing casualties. Most strategists spend hours analyzing the defensive patterns, planning supply lines, coordinating multi-phase attacks. And our human friend. Well, sir, he landed his entire fleet directly on top of the enemy base." The bridge fell silent again. Even the humming of the machinery seemed to pause in disbelief. "I'm sorry," Vex said slowly. "Did you just say he landed on top of the base?" "Yes, sir, all ships simultaneously. The base's shields were designed to deflect incoming projectiles and energy weapons, not to support the weight of 17 heavy cruisers and a dreadnought settling down like they were parking for a picnic. Commander Vex's species didn't have eyebrows, but if they did, both would have crawled off his forehead and filed for political asylum." The shields collapsed. "Instantly, sir. The entire defensive grid was crushed under the combined mass. Morrison's forces then simply walked through the wreckage and claimed the objective." But that's..." Vex struggled for words, his translator working overtime. "That's not even a strategy. That's barely organized falling. The simulation's physics engine registered it as a valid tactical approach," Blip offered helpfully, immediately regretting speaking when every eye in the room turned toward him. "Technically speaking, there was no rule against using gravitational force as a weapon." Vex stood up, paced to the observation window, and stared out at the swirling nebula beyond. His reflection looked back at him with the expression of someone who'd just been told their life's work was actually an elaborate practical joke. "How long have we been developing this simulation?" he asked. 14 years, sir, Kara replied. The best tactical minds from 47 different species contributed to its design. 47 species. 14 years. Countless hours of programming, testing, refining. Vex turned back to face his crew. And a human figured out a solution we never even considered in the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee. To be fair, sir, Lieutenant Kraz spoke up from the communications station, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. Humans do have a reputation for unconventional thinking. Unconventional. Vex's laugh could have powered a small moon. Kraz, unconventional is using a mining laser as a weapon. This is something else entirely. This is, he paused, searching for the right word, this is insulting. The door to the command center slid open with a soft hiss, and in walked the subject of their discussion. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood about average height for a human, with brown hair that looked like it had been styled by a particularly energetic hurricane, and a grin that suggested he was in on some cosmic joke the rest of the universe hadn't figured out yet. "Hey there," Jake said, raising one hand in what humans called a wave. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Your tech guys said you wanted to see me." The bridge crew stared at him with the collective intensity of 47 suns. Jake, seemingly oblivious to the tension, looked around with the casual interest of a tourist checking out a new restaurant. "Nice place you've got here. Very spacious, and purple. I like purple." Commander Vex stepped forward, his forearms moving in what his species considered a formal greeting, but probably looked to Jake like an attempt at interpretive dance. "Lieutenant Morrison," Vex began, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to discuss your performance in our tactical simulation." "Oh, that thing." Jake shrugged. "Yeah, that was fun. A bit straightforward, though. I was expecting something more challenging." The sound Vex made wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a sigh, and wasn't quite the noise a deflating balloon makes, but it managed to combine elements of all three. "Straightforward," he repeated. "Well, yeah, I mean, once you realize the shields only work against directed attacks, the solution becomes pretty obvious. Just drop something heavy on them." Jake looked around the room, noting the expressions of barely controlled disbelief. "Did I miss something? Was there some kind of trick to it?" Lieutenant Kara's tentacles had gone completely rigid, a condition her species' medical texts classified as acute bewilderment syndrome. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said carefully, "that simulation was designed to test advanced strategic thinking, resource management, and tactical flexibility. It incorporates variables from 7 different theaters of warfare and requires coordinated planning across multiple fronts." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I could see how that might be complicated if you were trying to do it the hard way." The hard way. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge nobody wanted to accept. "And what exactly do you consider the easy way?" Vex asked, his translator adding subtle harmonics that suggested he was reaching the end of his patience. "Well, most problems have simple solutions if you're willing to step outside conventional thinking. Your simulation was designed around the assumption that I'd try to fight through the defenses, right? But there wasn't actually any rule saying I had to engage them on their terms." Commander Vex walked over to his command chair and sat down heavily. "Lieutenant Morrison, that simulation has been tested by military academies across 47 different worlds. The average completion time is 36 hours. The fastest recorded time before today was just over 43 hours. Ha." Jake considered this. Maybe they were overthinking it. The bridge's environmental systems registered a sudden spike in ambient temperature as several crew members began what their respective species considered the physiological precursors to spontaneous combustion. "Overthinking," Vex said slowly, "a military simulation that cost more than some planets' annual defense budgets." "Hey, I'm not criticizing." Jake held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm sure it's a great simulation, really impressive graphics, very realistic physics engine. The explosions were particularly nice." "The explosions?" "Yeah, when the shields collapsed and all those defense turrets crashed into each other. Very cinematic. Though I have to say, the sound effects seemed a bit over the top. Do energy weapons really make that much noise in a vacuum? Tech specialist Blip made a noise like a computer trying to process a paradox. The simulation doesn't have sound effects in vacuum scenarios. The audio you heard was added for immersive purposes. Ah, that makes sense. Good attention to detail. Commander Vex stood up again, walked to the viewport, stared at the nebula for 30 seconds, then walked back to his chair. He repeated this process 3 times while the bridge crew watched in fascination. Lieutenant Morrison, he finally said, "How long have you been in the Terran Space Corps?" "About 18 months. Still pretty new, really. And your previous military experience?" "None. Well, unless you count laser tag. I was pretty good at laser tag." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of Lieutenant Kara's tentacles slowly sliding off her console and onto the floor. "Laser tag," Vex repeated. "Yeah, there was this place near my college that had these really elaborate courses. Multi-level, lots of obstacles, team-based scenarios. I figured it was good practice for spatial reasoning and tactical movement." "And this experience with laser tag helped you solve our simulation?" Jake shrugged. "Not really. The simulation was more like a puzzle game, honestly. You know, the kind where you have to figure out what the developers didn't think of." Commander Vex's translator began making small sparking sounds, apparently struggling with concepts that didn't exist in his language. "What the developers didn't think of," he managed. "Right. See, the thing about complex systems is that they usually have simple failure points. Your simulation was designed to test tactical thinking within established parameters, but it didn't account for someone ignoring those parameters entirely. Those parameters," Vex said, his voice rising slightly, "represent thousands of years of accumulated military wisdom from dozens of species." "Oh, absolutely, and I'm sure that wisdom is really valuable for traditional warfare. But the simulation wasn't traditional warfare, was it? It was a test, and tests always have exploits if you look hard enough." Lieutenant Kraz leaned forward in his chair. "Exploits?" "Loopholes. Unintended solutions. Ways to win that the test designers didn't consider." Jake looked around the room with genuine enthusiasm. "It's actually pretty common in human gaming culture. We call it speedrunning when you try to complete something as fast as possible using any means necessary." "Gaming culture," Vex said faintly. "Yeah, there's this whole community of people who spend their time finding the most efficient ways to beat various challenges. Some of the solutions are incredibly creative. There was this one game where the fastest completion method involved clipping through walls by manipulating the physics. The engine's collision detection. The sound coming from Commander Vex's translator now resembled a small electronic creature having an existential crisis. "You solved our military simulation," he said slowly, "using techniques from human recreational activities." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of weird." Jake grinned. "But yeah, basically." Commander Vex looked around his bridge at his crew. Kara was staring at her console like it had personally betrayed her. Blip was frantically running calculations on his secondary screen. Kraz was making notes on a tablet with the desperate concentration of someone trying to preserve their sanity through documentation. "Lieutenant Morrison," Vex said finally, "how would you rate the difficulty of our simulation?" Jake tilted his head thoughtfully. "On a scale of 1 to 10? Maybe a 4. The physics puzzle was interesting, but once you figured out the core mechanic, it was pretty straightforward." "A 4? Yeah, I mean, it might be harder if you were trying to do it the intended way," but Jake shrugged. "Why would you?" Commander Vex sat down in his chair and stared at the human standing before him. This small, unremarkable creature had just casually dismantled what the Galactic Council considered their most sophisticated tactical challenge, and he'd done it while treating the whole thing like an amusing diversion. "Lieutenant Morrison," Vex said, "I think we need to have a longer conversation." "Sure, I've got time, though I should probably mention your people said something about more simulations." I'm kind of curious to see what else you've got." The bridge crew exchanged looks of pure terror. "More simulations," Vex repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, apparently there's a whole series. Strategic planning, resource management, diplomatic scenarios. Sounds fun." Commander Vex closed his eyes and began what his species called the ritual of accepting inevitable doom. It was a meditation technique developed specifically for moments when the universe revealed itself to be far stranger and more terrifying than previously imagined. Outside the viewport, the nebula continued to swirl in patterns that suggested cosmic indifference to the struggles of lesser beings. Somewhere in the distance, a supernova exploded, marking the end of one star and the birth of something entirely new. On the bridge of the research station, a human named Jake Morrison stood waiting patiently while an entire command crew struggled to process the implications of what they'd just witnessed. And in the depths of the station's computer systems, dozens of other military simulations hummed quietly, blissfully unaware that their days of being taken seriously were numbered. 3 hours later, Commander Vex found himself in what his species euphemistically called a learning experience, but what everyone else recognized as a slow-motion disaster with educational value. The secondary simulation chamber buzzed with activity as technicians scrambled to set up monitoring equipment. Word had spread through the station faster than gossip at a diplomatic reception, and now representatives from 6 different species crowded the observation deck like spectators at a particularly brutal sporting event. "Perhaps," suggested Ambassador Trill, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's lights into rainbow patterns, "we should start with something simpler." Simpler? Vex's laugh had evolved beyond mere bitterness into something approaching philosophical resignation. "Ambassador, Lieutenant Morrison just turned our premier tactical simulation into what humans apparently call a speedrun. I'm not sure simpler exists in his vocabulary." Down in the chamber, Jake was examining the holographic interface with the casual interest of someone browsing a menu at a restaurant. He'd been given access to their diplomatic negotiation scenario, a complex multi-party simulation that typically required teams of specialists working for days to reach a satisfactory resolution. "Interesting setup," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's communication system. "Very detailed character backgrounds. Nice touch with the historical grievances database." Dr. Corvin, the station's chief behavioral psychologist, leaned forward in his observation chair. "The scenario involves mediation between 4 warring factions with centuries of conflict. Each group has incompatible demands, limited resources, and deep cultural animosity toward the others." "Sounds like family dinner," Jake replied cheerfully. The observation deck fell silent except for the soft humming of life support systems and what might have been someone whimpering. "The simulation begins now," announced the chamber's AI in a voice programmed to sound reassuringly neutral. "Participants will have access to all relevant diplomatic protocols, cultural databases, and historical precedents. The standard completion time ranges from 72 to 120 hours. Jake cracked his knuckles, a sound that somehow managed to be both casual and ominous. "Cool. Let's see what we're working with." The holographic environment materialized around him, transforming the sterile chamber into an ornate conference room. 4 figures appeared, each representing one of the warring factions: the militant Krogar Empire, the isolationist Seraph Collective, the merchant-focused Traders Alliance, and the religious fundamentalists known as the Divine Path. What followed could only be described as diplomatic warfare conducted at light speed. "All right, everyone," Jake began, addressing the 4 faction representatives with the tone of a camp counselor dealing with unruly children. "I've reviewed your files, and frankly, you're all being ridiculous." The Krogar representative, a simulation of a massive warrior species leader, bristled with programmed indignation. "You dare insult the honor of the Krogar Empire?" "I'm not insulting your honor," Jake replied calmly. "I'm questioning your math skills." Up in the observation deck, Ambassador Trill made a sound like wind chimes falling downstairs. Did he just call a Krogar bad at arithmetic? Your territorial disputes, Jake continued, pulling up a holographic map, are based on resource distribution conflicts that stopped being relevant about 50 years ago when asteroid mining became economically viable. You're literally fighting over rocks when there are entire asteroid belts full of the same materials just sitting there, unused. The Seraph Collective's representative, a graceful figure wreathed in simulated energy patterns, spoke with cool disdain. The young human oversimplifies complex cultural and territorial imperatives. Cultural imperatives like what? The Seraph need isolation to maintain their energy balance, right? Jake gestured toward the map. There are 14 uninhabited star systems within your preferred travel range. The Krogar want mining rights to heavy metals. There are 6 dead worlds with no ecological value that have more titanium than they could use in a century. The Traders Alliance representative, a being that looked like a cross between a merchant and a filing cabinet, interjected. Economic considerations require. Economic considerations, Jake interrupted, would suggest that you stop spending 60% of your GDP on military expenses and start investing in infrastructure that benefits everyone. Dr. Corvin's tentacles were writhing in patterns that his species used to express extreme confusion. He's completely ignoring established diplomatic protocols. And the divine path, Jake continued, turning to the religious faction's representative. Your objection seems to be that sharing resources with unbelievers violates your spiritual principles. The sacred texts clearly state. The sacred texts were written before interstellar travel was invented, Jake said flatly. I'm pretty sure your ancestors weren't contemplating asteroid mining regulations when they laid down cosmic law. Commander Vex gripped his chair's armrests with all 4 hands. This isn't negotiation. This is, what is this? Intervention, suggested Lieutenant Kara, who had recovered enough to operate her monitoring equipment. I think he's conducting what humans call an intervention. The simulation's 4 faction leaders were now arguing among themselves, but not about their traditional grievances. Instead, they were debating Jake's proposals with the kind of vigorous discussion that suggested they were actually considering his suggestions. Impossible, breathed tech specialist Blip. The simulation parameters were designed to maintain factional hostility. The AI personalities shouldn't be capable of this level of cooperation. Unless, Jake's voice carried from the chamber, the AI personalities are actually sophisticated enough to recognize logical solutions when presented clearly. Every head in the observation deck turned toward the chamber's communication pickup. Did he just? Ambassador Trill's crystalline form flickered with uncertainty. Was he talking to us? The observation deck has soundproof barriers, Dr. Corvin said slowly. There's no way he could have heard our conversation. Jake's grin was visible, even through the holographic overlays. Your barriers work great for blocking sound. They don't do much about electromagnetic transmission from your monitoring equipment. My ship's communication system picked up the feedback about 20 minutes ago. The silence in the observation deck reached levels that physicists would have found interesting to study. You've been listening to our entire conversation? Vex asked. Only the parts that weren't classified above my clearance level. Your security AI is pretty good at filtering sensitive information. Jake turned back to the simulation's faction leaders. Sorry about the interruption, folks. Where were we? We were discussing the proposed resource-sharing agreement, said the Krogar representative, and the fact that a simulated warrior was now speaking in reasonable and measured tones was possibly more disturbing than anything else that had happened. Right. So we're all agreed that the current territorial boundaries are maintained, but resource extraction rights are shared based on technological capability and infrastructure investment. The 4 faction leaders exchanged glances, consulted their databases, ran probability calculations, and then, in a moment that would haunt diplomatic theorists for generations, nodded in agreement. Simulation complete, announced the chamber's AI. All faction objectives achieved. Resolution time, 47 minutes, 12 seconds. The observation deck experienced what could only be described as a collective existential crisis. 47 minutes, Dr. Corvin repeated in the tone of someone discovering that gravity had been optional all along. He got 4 species who have been at war for 3 centuries to agree on a comprehensive peace treaty, Ambassador Trill said faintly, in less time than it takes to fill out the paperwork for a diplomatic meeting request. Commander Vex stood up, walked to the observation window, and stared down at Jake, who was now chatting casually with the holographic faction leaders about implementation timelines. Lieutenant Morrison, Vex called through the communication system. "Yes, sir." "How?" Jake looked up at the observation deck, his expression genuinely puzzled. "How what?" "How did you?" Vex gestured helplessly at the chamber. "How did you do that?" "Oh, the negotiation thing? It wasn't really that complicated. Most conflicts have practical solutions if you can get everyone to focus on actual problems instead of perceived problems." Perceived problems. Yeah, like 90% of their issues were based on assumptions that were outdated or just plain wrong. Once you correct the information asymmetries and align the incentive structures, cooperation becomes the logical choice. Dr. Corvin made a note on his tablet. Human demonstrates casual mastery of advanced game theory while discussing it like weekend hobby. Lieutenant Morrison, Ambassador Trill's voice carried a note of desperate hope. "What's your background in diplomatic studies?" "None, really. But I did play a lot of strategy games in college. Civilization, Europa Universalis, that kind of thing. You learn pretty quickly that warfare is expensive and trade agreements are profitable." The observation deck's occupants exchanged looks that conveyed entire philosophical discussions in the space of a few seconds. "Strategy games," Commander Vex said weakly. "Yeah, they're actually pretty good for learning basic diplomatic and economic principles. I mean, obviously real life is more complex, but the fundamental mechanics are similar." "Fundamental mechanics," Dr. Corvin repeated, making more notes. "Resource management, technological development, population happiness, diplomatic relations. It's all about balance and long-term thinking." Jake shrugged. "Plus, most games punish you pretty severely for starting unnecessary wars, so you learn to negotiate first and fight only when absolutely necessary." Ambassador Trill's form flickered as she processed this information. "You solved a century-old diplomatic crisis using principles from recreational software." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of silly." Jake grinned. "But yeah, basically." Commander Vex activated his personal communicator to display the remaining simulation queue. A holographic list appeared, showing dozens of scenarios: advanced fleet command, interspecies cultural integration, economic crisis management, pandemic response coordination, and others. "Lieutenant Morrison," Vex said carefully, "would you be interested in trying a few more scenarios?" "Absolutely. This is actually really fun. Way better than the training simulations back home." "What are the training simulations like in the Terran Space Corps?" Jake made a face. "Boring, mostly. Lots of repetitive drills, very predictable scenarios. Nothing like this. These actually make you think creatively. The irony was so thick you could have used it to armor a battle cruiser." Over the next 4 hours, Jake Morrison systematically worked through the station's entire simulation library. He completed the Advanced Fleet Command scenario by realizing that superior firepower was less important than superior logistics. He solved the cultural integration challenge by focusing on shared practical needs rather than attempting to bridge philosophical differences. He handled the economic crisis simulation by identifying regulatory inefficiencies that everyone had accepted as inevitable. Each solution was elegant, practical, and utterly devastating to established military and diplomatic doctrine. "Status report," Vex asked weakly as the final simulation ended. Lieutenant Kara consulted her displays with the expression of someone reading their own obituary. All scenarios completed successfully. The average completion time, 38 minutes. Total time for all scenarios, 4 hours, 17 minutes. And the previous record. The complete simulation battery had never been finished by a single individual. Team records ranged from 6 weeks to 4 months. Commander Vex looked around his observation deck at the assembled representatives, scientists, and military officials. They stared back with expressions that suggested they were all questioning fundamental assumptions about reality. "Gentlemen, ladies, and honored representatives," Vex said formally, "I believe we need to file some reports." "What kind of reports?" asked Dr. Corvin. "The kind that explain to our respective governments that everything we thought we knew about strategic thinking may need to be reconsidered." Down in the simulation chamber, Jake was examining the holographic interface with continued interest. "Hey," he called up to the observation deck, "do you guys have any scenarios that are actually challenging?" These were good for warming up, but I was hoping for something that might take a while to figure out. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ambassador Trill's crystalline form gently vibrating in harmonic frequencies associated with her species' expression of profound despair. "Lieutenant Morrison," Commander Vex said finally, "I think you may have just redefined what we consider challenging." "Really? Cool." Jake's enthusiasm was undiminished. "So what's next?" Commander Vex looked at his crew, then at the assembled observers, then at the holographic displays showing Jake's impossible completion times. "Next," he said slowly, "we try to figure out how to explain this to the Galactic Council." "Should be fun," Jake replied cheerfully. "I've never met a Galactic Council before. Do they like strategy games?" And somewhere in the depths of space, on dozens of worlds across the galaxy, military academies and diplomatic institutions continued their normal operations, but blissfully unaware that a human named Jake Morrison had just made their entire curriculum obsolete in slightly over 4 hours. The universe, as it turned out, had a sense of humor after all.